Welcome to Public Speaking with Peter George. Do you want to be calm, confident, and credible every time you speak in public? Then stay tuned as Peter and his guests discuss public speaking tips, techniques, and tactics that help you increase your impact, influence, and income. Here's your host, Peter George.
Speaking on stage and writing a book are often seen as two entirely different disciplines, and with good reason. But is it really that cut and dry? In this episode, prolific speaker and author Geralyn Gendreau compares and contrasts speaking and writing based on her own experiences. Tune in and discover if you have a speech or a book in you, and if you do, how to find your voice and clarify your message. A licensed psychotherapist since 1995, Geralyn is a playful, soul-provoking life coach who believes one of the keys to happiness is being able to laugh at yourself. A master storyteller, she is the author of Jungle Gene, the biography of her mentor, Gene Liedloff, who traveled into the pristine regions of the Venezuelan rainforest back in the 1950s and subsequently wrote a seminal book, The Continuum Concept. Here's my discussion with Geralyn Gendreau. Welcome to the show, Geralyn.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Geralyn, when and where did you give your first public talk?
You know, I was very young when I first spoke in front of people, so I don't have a clear memory of it. But the time that really stands out in my mind, I met a man named Duncan McIntosh, who's a London taxi driver and happened to be an amazing Shakespearean actor who had taken to reciting ecstatic poetry, specifically Rumi, who was the first whirling dervish. So I just had to do this. So I found a poem that I wanted to recite at one of his performances, and I memorized it. It was called The Indian Parrot. It's a Rumi story, actually. Stories are my favorite thing in the world. I mean, the easiest way for me to talk on stage is to speak in story. I would not spend a whole lot of time drilling down facts and figures. After memorizing this story called The Indian Parrot, I was nervous beforehand. I had that kind of dry mouth, racing heart. I don't get sweaty palms, but I get a racing heart. And Duncan told me, he said, you're going to forget your lines. You need to take it with you. You need to take it with you on stage. When I got up there, I went from being nervous to like hyper lucid. Like I could feel and see everybody in the room, and I nailed it without a hitch, like never stumbled on a word, never forgot a line. And I kind of knew, I didn't really consciously know, but when he said, you need to take your papers, I'm like, okay, but I think I have it memorized, but I took them anyway. That was a real breakthrough because I tend to be more of an introvert. In fact, I gave a book talk. I had a book release party just a week ago and put me on stage, put a microphone in my hand and just, all right, then we're going to town. Even though I always feel a little nervous first, I've learned that my heart will beat so much that I get hot and I can feel my heart just like, it's like I'm ready for takeoff, But the rest of the time I'm fairly shy. So I always say I'm a situational extrovert. And the best way to bring out my extrovert is to throw me on stage.
I've spoken to so many people, so many speakers who are introverts, and I'm one of them.
Isn't that wild? Well, I think we bottle it up so much that when we're actually put in a situation where we have to get over that introvertedness, it's like fire hose, Yeah,
and I think we're also less likely to want to live off the cuff. We want to be prepared. I know it is with me.
Yeah, I think I'm the opposite. I think I do tend to fly by the seat of my pants.
Do you really?
Yeah, at the book release party, I mean, I had 2 stories I wanted to read out of the book, but other than that, I picked a story to read today. But other than that, it's like I'm kind of the extemporaneous. I was on the debate team in college, and my favorite event was impromptu speaking. Now, my boyfriend was much better at it than I am, but he was a docent at Hearst Castle. He used to give tours. He was a Hearst Castle tour guide. Like, wow, what a training for public speaking that must have been.
I've been there several times. I wonder if he was one of them there when I was there.
It was many years ago, but you're probably about our age.
So when you are up on stage, what is it that you most like to talk about?
Well, that changes at different periods of my life. I wrote a book called Marriage of Sex and Spirit. It was actually an anthology I edited. And there was a period of time where I loved to talk about sex, but not so much anymore. I spent a lot of time reciting poetry. I love to tell the story of my near-death experience. That story has actually traveled around the world and come back to me because it's a very memorable story. I have told it many times, but every time I tell it, there is something fresh. There's something I say most every time. There's some way I frame it. So I learn about it and I live into it kind of from telling the story. It's like the story has a life of its own. That doesn't mean I fabricate indiscriminately. I do that when I'm writing fiction, but not when I'm telling that story. I try to be pretty precise. These days, my favorite thing to talk about is my book. It just came out, got international bestseller in a matter of days. Well, there's a copy. Oh, there's a copy back there. This is my favorite thing to talk about these days. And I can talk a blue streak about it because I spent the better part of the last 3 years deeply immersed in finalizing the manuscript.
It's a long process, isn't it?
It is. And I write books for a living. You know, I've been a ghostwriter. So writing a book isn't that complicated, but writing a biography about someone you knew who had an adventurous, wild life. She lived in the Amazon rainforest in the 50s. They didn't call it the rainforest then. That word hadn't entered the lexicon. It was the jungle. She had a fascinating life, and she was the Upper West Side Manhattan socialite, model for Paris Vogue, and ran off to the jungles with a blonde-haired, blue-eyed Italian count, no less, on a diamond hunting expedition. She wasn't Jane Goodall going to study or Margaret Mead. She was a young woman who was out for adventure. I love telling her story. And in the biography, our relationship is part of that story. And for all her brilliance about what makes solid human bonds, she had a really hard time with relationships. And our relationship was quite bumpy. We hit rough patches frequently. I met her at a lecture. I read her book after graduate school when I was like, okay, so now I know all about human neuroses and psychosis. I can name them. I can tell you the number in the DSM. I came here to A, sort myself out, and B, figure out what makes people happy. What I wanted to know was not how screwed up humans were. I wanted to know where all the happy people were and how they got that way, because I wanted to be with that, one of them. And this was before the positive psychology movement started. I'm dating myself, but I went to graduate school in the late 80s, early 90s, and I'd been out of school for 10 years by then. So now you can do the math and realize how very old I am.
What's the name of the book?
Jungle Jean. It's the biography of Jean Liedloff, who wrote a book called The Continuum Concept about her experience with the indigenous people of the Amazon. And that book became a child-rearing classic. No doubt you've seen women carrying a baby on her hip in a sling.
Sure.
Or now it's more like the Snuggly or the baby backpacks. She started that back in the 70s.
All right, let's go back to public speaking. When you were saying your heart races before you speak, and everybody prepares differently, how do you prepare before a talk?
Well, I expect that to happen. So if I'm performing with a group of people and I'm a key speaker at a certain point, we'll have a circle up, and we'll have like a bringing the minds together. So I like to prepare myself partly by, sometimes I'll go in the room where I'm going to speak before anybody arrives. And I'll just like feel myself grounded on the stage where I'm going to speak with nobody in there. So I can get familiar with the space. I can kind of own the space in a sense. And then I can pre-pave my experience, like program the room, program the consciousness in the room that I want to take them somewhere. I want to take them somewhere that's going to open their eyes to something, even just one little thing that they hadn't seen or thought of before.
When you feel your heart race and all those other things that happen to you, do you also believe that's the very same feeling or very close to the same feelings we get when we're excited?
Very much.
And we look at nervousness because that's our mindset, but we can look at those same feelings as excited?
Yeah, I think it's all in how you label it. I always say that fear and excitement are two sides of the same coin. Like you're walking into something that's unknown. I still have concerns about what are they going to think? Am I going to blow it? What if I drop my lines? When I was speaking at a book release party just 2 weekends ago, I kept losing my train of thought. Sometimes several trains run off the rail in a row. And then I have to ask the audience, I had to say, where was I? And we would track back. See, I just forgot my train of thought. What was the question?
We were talking about nervousness and excitement.
Right. Yeah, I tend to ride that feeling. My heart can just be like, boom, 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 and I get warm. And that's when I know that's like the signal you have something to say, girl. That's how I interpret it. It's like, okay, I'm being called on to step forward. I'm being pumped full of energy so I can share that energy with the room. It's like a beautiful thing. And it can be very intense.
If you were asked to give a TED Talk, what would you talk about?
I think I would talk about the continuum concept because it's a world-changing idea that had such an impact. So I would briefly say what it is and who she is. And then I would actually look at the science. Since she wrote her book, there's been quite a bit of science done, studies that demonstrate the veracity of her ideas. And I think in the second edition of this book, I'm going to do an appendix that's all the research. I could probably even come up with a PhD dissertation that some university somewhere would accept to summarize that data, overview those studies, and maybe even come up with a research design. Like one of the things I think about is kids who were raised that way. Like if I could somehow measure certain levels of self-esteem or safety, figure out some measures to see if they're different than the kids that were like pushed in the stroller or made to cry themselves to sleep. That would be a very interesting thing to me. So if I was going to do a TED Talk, I would focus on that more than her. I'd love to tell her story, but I think for TED, it would be more appropriate.
Do you think anybody's ever given a talk on TED similar to that?
I would say no. I doubt anybody has ever done anything to do with the continuum concept. I think it would be a unique one. Thank you. Thank you for that.
Now, as you know, many people avoid public speaking, seemingly at all costs. What advice would you give someone who's always avoided it, but has been asked to give a talk and feels they can't refuse?
Good question. I would say feel the fear and do it anyway, although that's oversimplified and trite. So if this person was a client of mine, I'm not a speaking coach, but I am a writing coach. And it's actually one of the things I do with my writing clients is I help them clarify their voice. So I think the most potent, practical, and strategically smart would be to actually, and you've probably done this yourself, but find someone in the audience or plant someone in the audience that loves you and look at them. And if they aren't there, find somebody who looks like them, find somebody who looks friendly. In your imaginal realm, put that person front row center. Your adrenaline is spiking. And we know that relationship is the thing that most readily regulates the nervous system so that it comes into the parasympathetic and calms down. Another thing you can do is actually immediately get friendly with the audience somehow, like maybe step down, make them laugh, self-effacing comments work, humanize yourself and enter into relationship with them. I think that's like biologically going to help because it's going to calm your nervous system if they're not just this audience who might be judging you. I saw Elizabeth Gilbert do that. She came out and she drops the F-bomb right away. She goes, well, so there it is, the F-bomb. We can get over that. So there's a way that your vulnerability shows and invites likability. Instead of walking out there, people think they have to go out there and look like they have it all together and be the total professional.
Right.
And that's not what's going to actually warm up your audience and give you the pleasure of speaking to people that you're establishing some kind of relationship with, even if it's just short term.
I agree with that, especially to your last point. I think a lot of people strive for perfection as opposed to connection.
Yeah. Well said.
And one of the things that when I have the opportunity is I meet people as they're filing into the room.
That's a really good idea because that warms up each individual.
It does. It calms my nerves as well.
I like what you're just talking about. That's a good idea. I don't do that. I tend to be in the back centering myself. But I think what you're talking about is really potent. Thank you.
That's what I used to do too, is I'd be in the back and I'd pace. It was one of my ways of getting my nervous energy into positive energy. I'd visualize, which I still do, visualize it all going well. But when I can, I get out in front too and just meet the people as they're filing in, saying hello. I've sat in the audience a few times. One time I was sitting next to a woman and she said, "Have you ever seen this guy speak?" And I said, "Yeah, and he's not all that good." And we're holding this conversation. All I kept doing. And after a while, she said, "Why are you here? You obviously don't like this guy."
And then they called you to the stage and you stood up.
Well, before they did that, I said, "You're right. I think I'll leave." And I got up and left and went around and went backstage. And I couldn't wait till I came out to look at her. And she half laughed and half shook her head.
Perfect.
Are you ready to work directly with Peter and develop your public speaking skills? Then schedule your free call with Peter at petergeorgepublicspeaking.com/call. Again, that's petergeorgepublicspeaking.com/call for your personal coaching and support. Now back to Peter and his guest.
Geralyn, where can our listeners learn more about you and your new book?
There is a website, junglegene.com. It's on Amazon. If you go to the website, however, you can put in your email address and you'll get the mini audiobook, me reading chapter 1. It's really fun. People love it. They listen to it multiple times. It's Gene going into the jungle for the first time. I also have a website, GeralynGendreau.com. On there, you can learn about my counseling services. I'm actually a licensed marriage and family therapist, believe it or not. I also have a writer's group, the Author's Chrysalis. And part of what we do in that Author's Chrysalis is help people find their voice, their writing voice, and clarify their teaching, what it is they're doing. Like people get really clear about what their work is and what the offering they're sharing is that they're going to put into the book, which really helps people who are public speaking to have it drilled down and to really have thought it through and made a unique contribution with what they have to say. This is called Do I Have a Book in Me? So it's very similar. Like, do you have a talk in you? Do you have a speech in you? Do you have a TED Talk in you? And one of the things I said was great books, great talks spill out of writers who have a passion. This is me writing to a client, so I'll read it without the reference to him. Great books spill out of writers who have a passion, a vision, and one or more of the following: an original idea, keen insight into a relatively new idea or phenomenon, new information from scientific study, an utterly fresh perspective, rarefied understanding in a well-explored subject area. 6, that's 5. 6, a ton of experience in a well-explored subject area, case studies, compelling anecdotal evidence, etc., from which to draw poignant conclusions. And then I said, then there are those who hold the ace, the gift of storytelling, plus a wild ride of a story that takes the reader above and beyond what's been said until now.
That's a great list. Thank you so much, Geralyn.
Oh, thank you. Thanks for your time and your curiosity and interest and expertise at these things.
That's a wrap of another episode of Public Speaking with Peter George. Be sure to rate, review, and subscribe wherever you listen to your favorite podcast. Tune in Monday when you'll hear another episode of Public Speaking with Peter George, and again Thursday for your next episode of Quick Bites, public speaking tips and techniques you can digest in 5 minutes or less. Until next time, remember, when it comes to speaking in public, you've got this.